The north wind had teeth, and it chewed on the Wyoming territory without mercy. It scraped across the frozen plains of the Red Draw, piling snow into drifts that looked like sleeping white beasts and turning the very air to glass. For Jack Hollis, the cold was an old enemy. It settled deep in the bones, but for him, it always found the shredded muscles and scarred bone of his left shoulder first. A dull and constant ache that served as his personal almanac. Winter had come, it said, and it would not be leaving soon. He pulled the collar of his sheepskin coat tighter, his gaze sweeping over the 2 heavy freight wagons and the 6 mules that pulled them. The animals steamed in the frigid air, their breaths pluming like smoke signals. This was his life now, a life he had chosen for its quiet predictability. Freight runs to the frontier towns, clean work, honest pay. He called it his principle of living quiet and doing clean business. The war had given him enough noise and enough dirty business to last a lifetime. Here, the only commands he gave were to his lead mule, and the only conflicts he faced were with the weather and the wretched apologies for roads. Red Butte was another day's hard travel, a speck of civilization clinging to the edge of nowhere. It promised a hot meal, a stiff drink, and a bed that did not rock with the wind. The thought was enough to keep him moving. The sky was the color of a fresh bruise, low and heavy with the promise of more snow. The scent of pine and frozen earth was sharp in his nostrils. Even the leather of his saddle felt brittle, as if it might crack if he moved too quickly. He saw the rider first as a dark smudge against the endless white, coming hard from the south. The horse was running on its last reserves of strength, its gait sloppy and desperate. Jack pulled his own mount to a halt, his hand resting near the butt of the Colt revolver on his hip. Trouble traveled fast in these parts, and this looked like trouble moving at a full gallop. The horse collapsed not 20 yards from the lead wagon, a shuddering fall that sent its rider tumbling into a snowdrift. Jack was off his horse in an instant, his boots crunching through the icy crust of the snow. The man was a mail rider. Judging by the faded insignia on his jacket, he was also dying. A dark, ugly stain was spreading across his chest, melting the snow beneath him into a crimson slush. Jack knelt, lifting the man's head gently. The rider's eyes were wide with a frantic urgency. His lips blue. "Took my pouch," he gasped, his breath a ragged whisper. "But not this." With a trembling hand, he pushed a long, narrow tube of sealskin into Jack's hands. It was unexpectedly heavy, sealed at both ends with plugs of hardened pine resin. "Promise me," the man rasped, his fingers clutching at Jack's coat. "Promise, it gets to the right hands." "Who are the right hands?" Jack asked, his voice low. The man's eyes searched Jack's face, looking for something Jack hoped he found. "Don't trust anyone in Red Butte," he choked out, a trickle of blood appearing at the corner of his mouth. "Especially not the law. They work for him." His last word was a sigh, a final letting go that the wind snatched and carried away across the prairie. He was gone. Jack stayed kneeling for a long moment, the sealskin tube cold in his hand. A mail rider was a federal agent, of a sort. An attack on one was a serious crime, but the man's warning echoed in the sudden, profound silence. "Don't trust anyone in Red Butte." He gently closed the rider's eyes and stood up, his jaw tight. His quiet life had just ended. He carried the man's body to the back of the second wagon and covered him with a spare canvas tarp. He would see him buried proper in Red Butte. Warning or no warning, that was part of doing clean business. But the sealskin tube, he tucked that deep inside his own coat. The man had died for it. Jack Hollis would not let that be for nothing. The ambush came 2 hours later, in the narrow pass that was the only way through the granite teeth of the eastern ridge. Jack had been expecting it. The dead rider was a herald, and Jack had spent enough years in the cavalry to know how to read the signs. He saw the glint of sun on a rifle barrel high in the rocks just before the first shot splintered the wooden frame of his lead wagon. "Get down," he yelled to his 2 drivers. "Men named Peterson and young Miller." 3 riders spurred their horses out from a thicket of snow-heavy pines. They wore identical canvas coats and had red bands tied around their left arms. Pinkerton men, or at least dressed like them. Hired muscle. The leader, a man with a face like a slab of raw meat and a thick, greasy mustache, reined in his horse. "Hollis," he shouted, his voice booming in the tight confines of the pass. "Mr. Trammell wants his property back. The tube the mailboy was carrying. Hand it over, and we will let you and your men pass." Jack's hand was already on his Winchester. "The only property I'm carrying is on my bill of lading," he called back, his voice steady, "and there is no mention of Mr. Trammell on it." The man sneered. "Have it your way, Commander." The name hit Jack like a physical blow. Commander, a name he had not heard in a decade, a ghost from a past he had tried to bury. It meant they knew who he was. This was not a random robbery. "The world exploded in gunfire," Jack fired back, levering around into the chamber with practiced efficiency, the crack of his rifle sharp and clean. One of the riders cried out and clutched his arm, his horse shying away. Peterson and Miller were returning fire from behind the wagons, the sound of their pistols popping in the cold air, but they were pinned down, outnumbered and outgunned. The hired guns were spreading out, working their way up the rocks on either side for a better angle. Jack knew the brutal math of a firefight. They had minutes, maybe less. His shoulders screamed in protest as he aimed and fired again. The cold, the pain, the smell of gunpowder. It all came rushing back, a flood of memories he had fought so hard to keep at bay. He was no longer Jack Hollis, freighter. He was Captain Hollis, United States Cavalry, trapped in a box canyon with the enemy closing in. Then something impossible happened. From the rocks high above, a sound like a whip cracking echoed through the pass. It was not a gunshot. The leader of the ambushers grunted, a look of pure shock on his face, and pitched forward out of his saddle. An arrow, fletched with dark feathers, was sticking out of his back. Before anyone could react, another arrow whistled down and slammed into the front wheel of the lead wagon, embedding itself deep in the thick oak. A rider on the rocks cursed and spun around, raising his rifle, searching for the source. Jack saw a flicker of movement against the snow and gray stone, a figure on a paint horse, moving with a fluid grace that defied the treacherous terrain. It was a woman, her form lean and whipcord strong, a bow in her hand. She loosed another arrow, a silent, deadly messenger that caught the second man in the throat. He fell without a sound. The third man, seeing his companions fall, lost his nerve. He fired one wild shot in the direction of the ghost on the rocks before wrenching his horse's head around and galloping back the way he had come. His retreat hurried and panicked. And then, silence. A silence more profound than before, broken only by the nervous stamping of the horses and the whistle of the wind through the pass. The figure on the rocks was gone, vanished as if she had been a spirit of the mountain, a phantom conjured by the snow. Peterson and Miller emerged from behind the wagons, their faces pale, their eyes wide. "What in God's name was that?" Peterson whispered, staring up at the empty rocks. Jack did not have an answer. He slowly lowered his rifle, his heart pounding in his chest. He looked at the dead men, at the arrow still quivering in his wagon wheel. He felt the weight of the sealskin tube against his ribs. Whoever had sent these men would send more, and whoever that woman was. She had just saved his life. But why? He pulled the arrow from the wheel. The craftsmanship was remarkable. The arrowhead sharpened obsidian. He rolled it in his fingers, a cold knot tightening in his stomach. The quiet life was well and truly over. That night, they made a cold camp in a sheltered basin. The wind howled over the rocks above, a mournful, lonely sound. Peterson and Miller were asleep, wrapped in their bedrolls near the low-burning fire. Jack took the first watch. Sleep was a country he knew he could not visit tonight. The events of the day played over and over in his mind. The dying rider, the ambush, the silent archer. He sat with his back against a wagon wheel, his Winchester across his lap, The firelight flickered, casting long, dancing shadows that played tricks on the eyes. The world was reduced to the small circle of warmth and light, a tiny island in an ocean of cold and darkness. He thought about the sealskin tube, a map, a winter count, the writer had said, a pictographic history of a tribe, something valuable enough to kill for, something his mysterious savior might also want. He did not hear a thing, not a crunch of snow, not a shifting of stone, not a whisper of movement. One moment he was alone, staring into the flames. The next, the firelight glinted on a blade held inches from his throat. A voice, low and clear as a winter stream, spoke in his ear. "Do not move, Commander." He froze, every muscle tensed. The person behind him was small, but the hand holding the dagger was unnervingly steady. He could feel the warmth of their body against his back. Slowly, he turned his head just enough to see her. It was the woman from the rocks. Her face was stern, her dark eyes holding an intensity that seemed to burn through the dim light. She wore buckskins, finely decorated with intricate beadwork, and her black hair was in 2 long braids. She was younger than he had imagined, but her eyes held a wisdom that was ancient. "I was tracking the men who attacked you," she said, her voice soft but laced with steel. "They stole something from my people, from our winter lodge. A history. You have it. It was not a question." Jack's mind raced. So this was the answer. She had not saved him for his own sake. She had saved her property. "The mail rider gave it to me," he said, his own voice quiet, trying not to betray the thunder of his heart against his ribs. "He was a thief, or he worked for them," she stated simply. "I do not care which. All I care about is what he gave you." Slowly, carefully. Jack raised one hand. "It is inside my coat. If I reach for it, you have to trust I am not reaching for a pistol." Her eyes narrowed, but she gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. The dagger did not waver. His fingers felt clumsy as he unbuttoned his heavy coat and drew out the sealskin tube. He held it out to his side. "I have not opened it. I gave the writer my word I would get it to the right hands. It seems I have found them." She studied him for a long moment, her gaze searching his face, much like the dying writer's had. Then, she did something that surprised him. She lowered the dagger and took a step back, though she never took her eyes off him. "Why should I believe you?" she asked. "Because my life has been complicated enough without adding grave robbing and breaking promises to a dying man to the list," he said, a hint of his old weariness creeping into his voice. He held the tube out to her. "Here, it belongs to your people." She did not take it. She looked from the tube to his face and then back again. "The men who attacked you work for a man named Silas Trammell. He wants what is in that tube, the map. He will not stop. If I take this now, his men will hunt me. If you keep it, they will hunt you. Either way, one of us is likely to end up dead before we reach the protection of my people." Jack considered her words. She was right. The ambush was proof of that. Handing it over to her now would just put a target on her back, and for some reason, after she had saved his life, that did not sit right with him, no matter her motives. "So what do you propose?" he asked. "We travel together, to Red Butte," she said. "There are people there, perhaps, who can be trusted. Not the law, but others. We will find them. And when we do, you will give me the winter count in their presence, so I know I have not been tricked." It was a strange sort of alliance, born of mutual threat and deep suspicion. But it was also the only plan that made any sense. "All right," he said, tucking the tube back inside his coat. "We ride together, on one condition." She raised an eyebrow. "No more knives to my throat." A flicker of something, maybe amusement, crossed her face. It was gone as quickly as it came. "You have my word, as long as you keep yours." She stood there for a moment, a warrior queen in the flickering firelight. "My name is Ayanna Whitebird." "Jack Hollis," he replied. She nodded, then turned and melted back into the shadows as silently as she had appeared. Jack let out a breath he did not realize he had been holding. He was alive. He had a formidable, if reluctant, new partner, and he was riding straight into a town where he could trust no one. He looked into the fire, a wry smile touching his lips. He heard a soft sound and turned to see Ayanna leading her paint horse into the circle of light. She moved with an easy, silent grace. She looked at him, her expression unreadable. "You talk a great deal for a man who lives a quiet life, Commander." Jack felt the smile widen just a fraction. "I only talk when I need to stay alive." "Ma'am?" She considered that for a moment. Then, for the first time, he saw the corner of her mouth twitch, the barest hint of a smile. "A good reason." She conceded, and began to tend to her horse. The truce had begun. The uneasy peace held through the night and into the gray, bitter morning. Ayanna moved with an economy of motion that Jack, a man trained by the army's rigid discipline, found both foreign and fascinating. She was a part of the landscape, while he was merely a traveler upon it. His men, Peterson and Miller, watched her with a mixture of awe and fear, giving her a wide berth as she prepared her horse. They had seen what she could do. They broke camp and pushed on, the wagons creaking in protest against the cold. The sky remained a solid, unforgiving sheet of gray. By midday, the wind began to pick up, not the steady blow of the day before, but a restless, searching wind that came in sharp, violent gusts. Snow began to fall, not in gentle flakes, but in a hard, stinging sleet that quickly thickened into a blinding curtain of white. Within an hour, they were in a full-blown blizzard. The world dissolved. There was no sky, no land, only the swirling, suffocating chaos of the storm. "We can't go on," Peterson yelled, his voice barely audible over the gale. "The mules are spooked and I can't see the man in front of me." Ayanna rode back alongside Jack's horse, her face already masked in a layer of fine snow. "There are rocks," she shouted, pointing into the white void to their right. "An overhang. We can shelter there." Jack trusted her. He could see nothing, but her senses were attuned to this land in a way his would never be. He gave the order, and they veered off the barely visible track, following her into the storm. She led them to a shallow rock shelter, a wide, scooped-out hollow in a granite cliff face that offered a reprieve from the direct assault of the wind. It was not warm, but it was a world away from the maelstrom outside. They unhitched the mules and huddled them together in the deepest part of the shelter. The men built a small, smoky fire with the dry wood they carried. Jack ground coffee beans with the butt of his pistol and boiled a pot of thick, black coffee over the flames. He passed a tin cup to Ayanna. She took it, her gloved fingers wrapping around its warmth. "Thank you," she said, her voice quiet. They sat in silence for a while. The only sounds the shriek of the wind and the crackle of the fire. The storm was a wall, sealing them off from the rest of the world. "The wind will try to steal our warmth," Ayanna said, looking at the way the snow was beginning to drift into the edges of their shelter. "We must help the rocks." She showed him what she meant. She began scooping up snow from the leeward side of the shelter and packing it firmly into the gaps on the windward side, building a low wall. Jack, Peterson, and Miller followed her lead. The work was hard and cold, but he could feel the difference immediately. The packed snow acted as an insulator, blocking the drafts and containing the small bubble of relative warmth from the fire in their bodies. He was learning that survival out here was not about fighting the land. It was about understanding its rules and bending with them. Later, huddled under a thick wool blanket, Jack found his gaze drifting to Ayanna. In the firelight, he saw something tied into the end of her left braid. It was a small bundle of what looked like sweetgrass and hawk feathers, bound with a strip of blue-beaded leather. A bit of snow had collected on it, acting without thinking, his gesture purely one of instinctual tidiness. He reached over to brush the snow away. Her reaction was instantaneous. She flinched back as if he had struck her, her eyes flashing with a sudden, fierce anger that startled him. Her hand went to the knife at her belt. "Do not touch that," she said, her voice a low, dangerous hiss. Jack froze, his hand still in the air. I was just brushing off the snow. It is not for you to touch, she said, her voice tight with an emotion he could not name. It was more than anger. It was a deep, profound violation. It is a prayer, a connection. You do not touch another person's prayer. He saw his mistake then. It was not just a decoration. It was something sacred. He felt a flush of shame rise in his neck. He had spent years among the Cheyenne and the Arapaho during his service. But he had been a soldier, not a student of their ways. He had seen them as the enemy, or as obstacles, not as people with a culture as deep and complex as his own. He lowered his hand slowly. "I'm sorry," he said, and he meant it. "I did not know. I meant no disrespect." She stared at him, the fire in her eyes slowly banking, replaced by a cool, appraising look. "Your apology is a leaf in the wind. It flies away. You will apologize in the proper way." She instructed him. He was to stand, place his right hand over his heart, and lower his eyes. It was a gesture of humility, of sincerity. He did as she asked, feeling the weight of his ignorance. "Say this," she commanded softly. "Na hesev." "Na hesev," he repeated, his tongue clumsy around the unfamiliar sounds. "It means, I am sorry. It means, I am in mourning for the wrong I have done you. It has weight," she explained. He stood there for a moment, his hand over his heart, his eyes on the snowy ground. The wind howled outside, but inside their small shelter, there was a profound stillness. When he finally looked up, her expression had softened. The anger was gone. "Now you know," she said simply, and turned back to the fire. It was both a lesson and an absolution. The moment was strange, a cringe-worthy mistake followed by a quiet, shared warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. The storm raged for 2 days. On the third morning, they woke to a world of blinding white and aching silence. The snow had stopped, and the sun, when it finally broke through the clouds, made the landscape sparkle as if it were covered in diamonds. As they dug the wagons out, Ayanna scouted ahead. She returned an hour later, her face grim. "Riders passed this way," she said, her voice low. "After the storm broke, 4 of them." Jack joined her where she stood, looking at a set of tracks in the fresh snow. The horses had been shod. One set of prints was distinctive. The shoe had a clipped toe and a single, pronounced calkin on the outside heel. Jack felt the old scar on his shoulder begin to ache with a sharp, familiar pain. "I know that shoe," he said, his voice flat. "It belongs to a man named Wade Reed." Ayanna looked at him. "You know him?" "We served in the same theater," Jack said, the words tasting like ash. "He was a scout for Custer, a freelancer. He rode with the 7th. It was an inadequate description. Wade Reed was a butcher who enjoyed his work, a man who saw the war not as a duty, but as an opportunity. A man Jack had faced across a bloody creek bed once, a lifetime ago. A man he had hoped never to see again. Reed working for Trammell meant this was far more dangerous than he had imagined. That night, the conversation came easier. The shared danger and the intimacy of the storm shelter had eroded some of the walls between them. Ayanna, seeing the troubled look in his eyes, finally began to explain the full stakes. "I am a scout for the council of my people," she began, her voice a low murmur as she stitched a tear in one of Miller's canvas coats. "I was one of the guides for the Treaty Commission 2 years ago, the one that drew the boundaries of our lands." She paused, her fingers stilling. "That map in the sealskin tube is one of the original treaty copies, but it is marked with more than boundaries. It is marked with geological surveys. Trammell wants it because it shows a large copper deposit deep in the heart of the White Crane Valley." She looked at Jack, her dark eyes searching his. "The valley is sacred to my people. It is where the spirits of the winter cranes rest before their journey south. Trammell's railroad needs water. His plan is to use the treaty map to find a legal loophole, a misdrawn line, to justify building a dam at the mouth of the valley. It would flood the sacred grounds and give him sole access to the copper." Suddenly, it all clicked into place. The desperation of the mail rider, Trammell's ruthlessness, Wade Reed's involvement. It was a classic Western land grab, wrapped in a veneer of legality and progress. "The winter count," Jack said, "is the proof of your people's claim to that land. Isn't it a history stretching back generations, showing you have always been there?" She nodded. "It is our memory, our soul. Without it, in your courts, we are just people living on a piece of land. With it, we are a nation with a history as old as the mountains." She looked down at her sewing. "And there is more. I saw the mail rider. Before he was attacked, he met with a territorial official. I think there is something else in that tube. Something Trammell wants silenced even more than he wants the map." "A ledger," Jack breathed, the thought coming to him like a cold shock. Records of bribes, payments to officials to look the other way. "Yes," she confirmed, "that is what I believe." The scope of it settled on him, heavy as a shroud. This was not just about a stolen artifact, it was about the wholesale theft of a people's future, greased by corruption that went to the very top of the territorial government. That night, the nightmares came for him. He was back on the banks of the Washita, the pre-dawn air thick with the smell of wood smoke and death. The thunder of shod hooves was all around him, not the disciplined sound of a cavalry charge, but the chaotic drumming of a panicked rout. He had been given a vague order: secure the flank. And in the confusion, in the swirling snow of that terrible morning, he had led his men into a trap. He still saw the faces of the men he had lost, their eyes wide with surprise and betrayal. He woke with a start, his hand clamped around the butt of his pistol, his heart hammering against his ribs. The fire was low, casting a soft orange glow on the sleeping forms of his men. Ayanna was sitting watch, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders. She was looking at him, her expression unreadable in the shadows. "The sound of horses troubles your sleep," she said. It was not a question. He did not answer, just stared into the dying embers of the fire, the ghosts of his past swirling in the smoke. "There is a shadow in your eyes, Commander," she said softly. "It was there when I first saw you. It is deeper now." He finally looked at her. "Some shadows you earn. You carry them with you." "My people say that a shadow cannot exist without light," she replied. "You must find the light to make it bearable." They sat in a comfortable silence after that, two sentinels guarding a dangerous secret under the vast, star-dusted Wyoming sky. The jagged peaks of the mountains around them looked like the teeth of a great beast, and the frozen, spiny arms of the yucca plants were like skeletal hands reaching from the snow. As the first hint of dawn touched the eastern sky, Jack knew he had crossed a line. His quiet life was a distant memory. He was in this now, all the way. He looked at Ayanna, her profile etched against the growing light. "I will not betray the man who gave me this," he said, touching the sealskin tube inside his coat. "And I will not sell out the woman who saved my life." She met his gaze, her own eyes clear and steady. "And I will see you clear of Wade Reed's territory, Jack Hollis, if everything falls apart." It was a promise, made in the heart of the frozen wilderness. An alliance forged in snow and blood, and sealed with the quiet understanding of two people who recognized the shadows in each other's souls. Red Butte rose from the prairie like a festering wound. It was a chaotic jumble of raw timber buildings, canvas tents, and muddy streets churned into a brown gumbo by the passage of countless wagons, horses, and men. The air was thick with the smell of coal smoke, cheap whiskey, and manure. After the clean, cold silence of the wilderness, the town was a full-blown assault on the senses. The Golden Spur Saloon was already roaring with noise, spilling yellow light and the discordant notes of a badly tuned piano into the gray afternoon. Across the street, the sign for Mrs. O'Rourke's Mercantile creaked in the wind, promising everything from flour and beans to dynamite and lace. As they guided the wagons down the main thoroughfare, Jack felt 100 pairs of eyes on them, or rather, on the woman who rode beside him. Men stopped their conversations, their face hardening with suspicion and contempt as they saw Ayanna. Women pulled their children a little closer, peering from behind parted curtains. Ayanna met their gazes without flinching, her expression a mask of calm indifference. But Jack could feel the tension in the set of her shoulders. She was a hawk in a chicken coop, and everyone knew it. Before he could even pull the wagons to a halt in front of the livery stable, a man stepped out of a nearby office. He was tall and impeccably dressed in a fine black coat, his face clean-shaven, his silver hair neatly combed. A polished tin star was pinned to his chest. Marshal Harlan Voss. He moved with an unhurried, self-assured air, and his smile was as bright and cold as a winter morning. "Welcome to Red Butte, Mr. Hollis," the marshal said, his voice a smooth, cultured baritone that was entirely out of place in the rough town. "We've been expecting you. Word travels fast." "Marshal," Jack acknowledged with a curt nod. He swung down from his horse, the old ache in his shoulder flaring up. "Just here to deliver my freight and move on." Voss's smile didn't waver, but his eyes were sharp, missing nothing. They flickered to Ayanna and then back to Jack. "Of course, just a small formality. Town ordinance requires me to inspect all incoming freight for contraband. You understand. We run a clean town here." Jack felt a cold knot form in his gut. The dead mail rider's words echoed in his mind. "Don't trust anyone in Red Butte, especially not the law. My bill of lading is in order. Marshal, signed and sealed in Cheyenne." "I have no doubt," Voss said smoothly. "But the law is the law. It applies to everyone equally. It is what separates us from the savages." He let the last word hang in the air, his gaze once again sliding toward Ayanna. Jack held the man's stare. This was the first move in a game he did not want to play. "My men and I are tired and cold. Marshal, the inspection can wait until morning." "The law does not wait, Mr. Hollis," Voss replied, his tone still perfectly pleasant, yet leaving no room for argument. "My deputies will be by in 1 hour." He tipped his hat and walked away, his polished boots leaving clean, sharp prints in the muck. "He knows," Ayanna said, her voice a low murmur only Jack could hear. He was not looking for contraband. He was looking for the tube. Jack nodded, his jaw tight. "Let's get these wagons unloaded. And find some allies, fast." He found the first one in a small, tidy building with a sign that read, "Dr. Mei Liao, physician and surgeon." A stray bullet during the ambush had torn a shallow furrow along Jack's forearm, a wound he had ignored but which was now beginning to throb angrily. The inside of the clinic was clean and smelled of carbolic acid and strange, aromatic herbs. Dr. Liao was a petite woman with intelligent, assessing eyes and hands that moved with deft, certain grace. She cleaned and stitched the wound without wasting a single word, her focus absolute. "This is a gunshot wound," she stated, tying off the final suture. "Occupational hazard," Jack said. She glanced up at him, her expression unreadable. "There are many occupations in Red Butte. Most of them are hazardous. This town is built on Silas Trammell's ambition, and he is not a careful builder." She wrapped a clean bandage around his arm. "Keep it clean, and be careful who you trust. Mr. Hollis, not all healers in this town wear a doctor's sign." It was a warning, delivered as a simple statement of fact. Jack knew he had found someone who saw the town for what it was. Meanwhile, Ayanna had slipped away. Jack found her not in the saloon or the mercantile, but standing in the quiet solitude of the small clapboard chapel at the edge of town. A lone woman in a black habit was tending to a small garden of winter-hardy herbs near the door. Sister Bernadette was older, her face a roadmap of fine lines, but her eyes were clear and possessed a surprising strength. She looked at Ayanna not with fear or suspicion, but with a quiet, open curiosity. Jack watched from a distance as the two women spoke, their voices too low for him to hear. He saw Ayanna gesture, explaining something with a calm intensity. He saw the sister listen, her head bowed, her hands clasped. Then, She nodded and led Ayanna inside the chapel. When Ayanna emerged a few minutes later, her hands were empty. The sealskin tube was safe. For now. Tucked away in a consecrated chest, hidden in the one place in town where even Marshal Voss might hesitate to tread. Their next stop was the Chamber of Commerce, a grand title for a dusty room above the land office. It was there they saw him. Silas Trammell, his portrait, rendered in rich oil paints, dominated the room. He was depicted as a visionary, a titan of industry, his hand resting on a globe, his eyes fixed on some distant, glorious future. The plaque beneath read, Silas Trammell taming the West, forging the future. He looked like a Roman emperor, promising civilization, clean water, and honest work to the masses. And there, on a large table beneath the portrait, was the proof of his vision. It was a detailed architectural drawing, a blueprint for a massive dam, a dam that cut directly across the heart of a valley marked with a name that made Jack's blood run cold: White Crane Valley. The lines of the dam were clean and precise, the work of a professional draftsman. They erased a sacred place with the casual indifference of a man swatting a fly. As they stood there, taking in the casual brutality of the plan, the land agent came bustling in. He was a small, nervous man who seemed to live in constant fear of his own shadow. He did not notice them at first, too busy talking to a pair of rough-looking men in surveyor's gear. "Mr. Trammell wants those survey stakes in the ground by the end of the week," the agent said, his voice a reedy whine. "The team leaves in 3 days. Once the stakes are down, it's a done deal. The territorial legislature will have no choice but to approve the appropriations." 3 days. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. A ticking clock had started. That evening, Marshal Voss found Jack in the livery stable, where he was checking on the mules. The marshal was alone this time, his professional smile firmly in place. "A word," Mr. Hollis Voss began, leaning against a stall door. "I am a practical man. I believe in peace, in order, and in everyone getting what they are due." Jack continued to curry the lead mule, not looking at the marshal. "Is that so?" "It is," Voss said. "Silas Trammell is a man of great importance. He is bringing progress to this territory. He needs certain legal documents to smooth the way, documents that a certain mail rider may have been carrying." He paused, letting the implication sink in. "A man like you, a man who values a quiet life, could find himself in a great deal of trouble. Or," he continued, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, "he could find his pockets lined and his path cleared. Trammell is a generous man. Exchange a piece of useless paper for a lifetime of peace and quiet. It seems like a fair trade to me." Jack finally stopped his work and turned to face the marshal. He let a look of honest confusion cross his face. "Marshal, I have no idea what you are talking about. I am a freight hauler. I carry what is on my manifest. Nothing more." Voss's smile tightened at the edges. Before he could respond, Ayanna spoke from the shadows of the hayloft above. She had been there the whole time, listening. "Marshal," she said, her voice clear and carrying a sharp, cutting edge. "Perhaps you should trade your integrity for a looking glass. It might help you find your spine." The marshal's face went rigid, the mask of civility cracking for just an instant to reveal the cold fury beneath. He shot a look of pure venom up at the hayloft, then composed himself, straightening his coat. "You would be wise to choose your friends more carefully." "Hollis," he said, his voice clipped. He turned and walked out of the stable without another word. Jack let out a long breath. "You have a knack for making friends," he said, looking up at her. "I only speak the truth," Ayanna replied, swinging down from the loft with the agility of a cat. His spine is owned by Trammell. As if summoned by the devil's name, the doors to the saloon across the street swung open, and a man stepped out. He was tall and lean, with a gunslinger's predatory grace. A long scar tugged at the corner of his mouth, pulling it into a permanent, humorless smirk, even from across the street. Jack recognized him instantly. Captain Wade Reed. Reed's eyes scanned the street, and then they locked onto Jack. The smirk widened. He strode across the muddy street, his spurs ringing with a faint, musical menace. "Well, well," Reed said, his voice a low drawl. "Captain Hollis, it has been a long time." He used the rank as an insult, a reminder of a past Jack wanted to forget. "Reed," Jack said, his voice flat. He could feel Ayanna tense beside him. "I heard you were out this way." "Pushing mules," Reed said, looking Jack up and down with open disdain. "A bit of a step down from leading a cavalry charge, isn't it?" He ignored Ayanna completely, as if she were a piece of the scenery. "We should have a drink, for old time's sake. Remember the Washita, now that was a real fight." "I'm busy," Jack said, his hand resting near the butt of his Colt. Reed's gaze was cold as a snake's, too busy for an old comrade. "That is a shame." He took a step closer. "You know, some things have a value beyond money. Things with history, sentimental value." His eyes flickered toward Ayanna for a barest fraction of a second. But Jack knew the message was for him. He was talking about the Winter Count. It would be a tragedy if such a valuable piece of history were to get lost or fall into the wrong hands. Mr. Trammell is a great collector of such things. He likes to preserve them. The threat was unmistakable. Reed was Trammell's enforcer. He knew they had the tube, and he was daring them to do something about it. "You tell Trammell," Jack said, his voice dangerously quiet, "that I deliver my freight, and that is all." Reed chuckled, a dry, rattling sound. "Always the good soldier. Hollis, even when you are on the losing side." He tipped his hat in a gesture of mock respect and walked back toward the saloon. Jack and Ayanna stood in silence for a long moment, the evening chill settling around them. The pieces were all in place. Voss, Reed, Trammell, a corrupt marshal, a ruthless killer, and a powerful man who would stop at nothing to get what he wanted. The chapel was a temporary refuge for the sealskin tube, but it was not a fortress. Voss would not hesitate to desecrate it if he had to. And the survey team was leaving in 3 days. "We cannot wait," Ayanna said, her eyes dark with urgency. "We cannot fight them all, not head on." "No," Jack agreed. He looked across at the darkened building that housed the land office and Trammell's local headquarters. "But Voss and Reed think we are just protecting the tube. They do not know that we know about the ledger." A spark of understanding lit Ayanna's eyes. "If we had a copy of that ledger," she whispered, "we would have a weapon they do not know we possess." "It would give us leverage," Jack finished, "a way to expose Trammell before he can bury us." The decision was made in that quiet moment. A shared, unspoken agreement. The risks were enormous. But the alternative was to let Trammell win, to let him drown a sacred valley and erase a people's history. "Tonight," Jack said, his voice firm, "we break into Trammell's office." The plan was a patchwork quilt of desperation and trust, stitched together in the quiet corners of Red Butte. Dr. Mei Liao provided a small, heavy bottle of chloroform, her face impassive as she explained its use. "A saturated rag held over the mouth and nose will grant you a few minutes of quiet," she said, her calm tone making the act seem almost clinical. "Use it only if you must." From the cavernous storeroom of her mercantile, Mrs. O'Rourke, a woman whose Irish eyes saw more than they let on, produced a long, sturdy plank. "Lost a bit of weight off the side of my porch," she said with a wink. "The wind, you know, awful fierce." And Sister Bernadette, her faith as practical as it was profound, scheduled a special Vespers service for that evening, a call to prayer for the soul of the town. She sent a handwritten invitation to Marshal Voss himself, knowing his vanity would not allow him to refuse such a public display of piety. The town's disparate threads of decency were weaving themselves into a net. Night fell on Red Butte like a fist closing. The moon hid its face behind a thick veil of clouds, leaving the back alleys in an inky blackness that swallowed sound and light. The air was cold enough to make a man's breath crystallize. Behind the land office, the smell of stale beer from the Golden Spur's back door mingled with the damp. earthy scent of the alley. Jack and Ayanna moved through the shadows, two ghosts on a mission. Ayanna was the first to move. She laid the plank, bridging the narrow gap between a woodshed roof and the second-story windowsill of Trammell's office. She crossed it not like a person walking, but like water flowing, a silent, fluid movement that was over in a heartbeat. She clung to the window frame, a dark silhouette against the darker building. Jack followed, his movements more deliberate, heavier. The plank groaned under his weight, a sound that seemed as loud as a gunshot in the stillness. He held his breath until he was safely across. He pulled a small leather roll from his pocket. Inside, nestled in soft felt, were several pieces of thin, stiff wire. He took one, a length of piano wire he had salvaged years ago, and fed it gently into the seam of the window lock. He closed his eyes, his touch delicate, searching for the tumblers. The skills of war were many, and not all of them involved a rifle. "Commander," Ayanna whispered from beside him, her voice a breath of warm air in the cold. "You should consider a new trade." Jack felt the last tumbler click into place. He slid the window sash up without a sound. "I already did," he whispered back. "This is just an old habit." He slipped inside, Ayanna following so closely she seemed a part of his own shadow. Trammell's office was even more opulent than the public room downstairs. A thick Aubusson rug covered the floor, deadening their footsteps. The air was rich with the scent of leather-bound books, expensive brandy, and the faint, cloying smell of cigars. A large mahogany desk stood like an altar in the center of the room, and on the wall behind it, a dozen maps of the territory were pinned, the roots of Trammell's planned railroad empire scrawled across them in bold, red ink. They worked in a silent, practiced tandem. Ayanna moved to the desk, her fingers ghosting over papers, her eyes scanning documents with an unnerving speed. Jack went to the massive iron safe that stood in the corner, partially hidden by a heavy velvet curtain. He ran his fingers over the combination dial. It was a Sargent and Greenleaf, a model often used by the Army for field payrolls. He knew its weaknesses. He put his ear to the cold metal, his fingers turning the dial with a slow, patient deliberation. He was not listening for a sound, but for a feeling, a subtle shift in the mechanism's resistance that was more vibration than noise. Ayanna came to his side, holding up a sheaf of papers. "Letters," she breathed. "From the Pinkerton office in Chicago, confirming payment for security operatives under the command of Captain Wade Reed." Jack nodded, his focus entirely on the safe. "Keep looking." The final number settled into place. He felt it, a faint tremor that traveled up his arm. He gripped the heavy handle and pulled. The door swung open with a well-oiled, nearly silent sigh. Inside, nestled amongst stacks of currency and property deeds, was a thick, leather-bound ledger. Jack pulled it out and opened it. The pages were filled with a neat, precise script, a meticulous record of corruption, names of territorial judges, land agents, even a United States congressman, were listed next to dates and dollar amounts. It was a confession in black and white, and tucked inside the back cover was another document, a draft of a territorial order, typed and awaiting a signature. It authorized the immediate and necessary relocation of the Northern Cheyenne from the White Crane Valley region, citing instability of the land and the needs of territorial progress. It was a death warrant for Ayanna's home, already written. Suddenly, a small, sharp, metallic click echoed from the doorway. Jack looked down. His boot had just brushed against a thin, almost invisible tripwire stretched across the threshold. A tiny bell, connected by a pulley system, began to jingle insistently in the office downstairs. They both froze. A muffled shout came from the street, followed by the sound of running feet. They had been discovered. "The window," Jack hissed, shoving the ledger and the other papers into his coat. But as they turned, they saw the yellow beams of several lanterns bobbing in the alley below. They were trapped. Ayanna's reaction was not one of panic. but of pure predatory instinct. In one fluid motion, she knocked an arrow, drew, and released. The arrow sped across the room and struck a large oil lamp on a side table. The glass chimney shattered, and the lamp toppled, spilling burning oil across a stack of newspapers. Flames erupted with a hungry whoosh, and thick, acrid smoke began to billow through the room, creating an instant screen of choking blackness. Through the smoke, Jack saw his own escape, a heavy-duty pulley, used for hoisting supplies and furniture up to the second floor, was bolted to the wall near the window. A thick rope was looped through it, its end coiled neatly on the floor. He grabbed the rope, testing its strength. He threw the coiled end out the window. "Go!" he yelled to Ayanna, but she was already grabbing his arm, shoving him toward the window. "You are heavier. You will go faster." There was no time to argue. He swung himself out into the smoke-filled night, his hands and boots scrabbling for a purchase on the rope. He slid more than climbed, the rough hemp burning his palms. The ground rushed up to meet him. He let go and dropped the last 10 feet, his legs jarring as he landed in a crouch. His boots sank into something soft and foul-smelling. He had landed inches from a massive pile of fresh horse manure. Ayanna followed a moment later, descending the rope with a controlled grace that made his own clumsy escape look pathetic. She landed silently beside him, her knife already in her hand, her eyes scanning the darkness. The sounds of alarm were growing. Men shouting, a window breaking somewhere above. They scrambled over a low fence and disappeared into the labyrinth of Red Butte's back alleys. They found refuge in a small, hidden lean-to behind Dr. Liao's clinic, a space barely big enough for 2 people, stacked with crates of medicinal herbs. It was there, in the flickering light of a single candle, that the adrenaline began to fade, leaving a deep, bone-aching weariness in its place. Ayanna, ever practical, found a small brazier and a handful of charcoal. She produced a skinned rabbit from her pack, along with some wild sage. Soon, the small space was filled with the warm, savory aroma of rabbit stew. It was a simple, grounding act that stood in stark defiance of the chaos they had just escaped. They ate in silence, sharing a single bowl. The shared danger had forged a new kind of intimacy between them, a bond that went deeper than words. When they had finished, Ayanna stared into the soft glow of the charcoal. "My grandmother's name was Navoka," she said, her voice a low murmur. "She taught me to read the sky, not just the stars that make the shapes you see, but the spaces between them. She said that is where the real stories are. The story of the dark is as important as the story of the light." Jack watched her, the candlelight softening the hard lines of her face. He saw not just the warrior who had saved his life, but the woman who carried the weight of generations in her memory. He found himself speaking, the words coming from a place he kept locked away from the world. "I had a wife. Her name was Eleanor." He had not spoken her name aloud in years. "She died in 71. The cholera took half our town back in Ohio. She had a laugh that could make you forget a winter ever existed." He stopped. The memory, a sudden, sharp ache in his chest. "That is when I came west. I was looking for a place so quiet I could not hear the ghosts." They sat in the small, warm silence, the ghosts of a wise grandmother and a laughing wife filling the space between them. He felt a profound, unspoken understanding pass between them. He saw the shadow in her eyes, the shadow of a people facing extinction, and she saw the shadow in his, the shadow of a man who had lost his light. He reached out, his hand hovering over hers for a bare second before he drew back, his fingers brushing against hers. The touch was fleeting, lighter than a breath, but it sent a jolt of warmth through him. Their eyes met, and in that moment, the air was thick with things unsaid. The nearness was a palpable force, a magnet pulling them closer, but they both held their ground, a silent, mutual agreement to honor the fragile safety of the moment, to not rush what was growing between them. It was a boundary built not of fear, but of profound respect. Finally, Jack pulled the stolen papers from his coat, They spread the ledger open in the candlelight. The neat columns of names and numbers laid Trammell's entire conspiracy bare. "High Basin," Jack said, his finger tracing a line item. "Payment to the surveyor for the High Basin Bridge project." He looked at the date. 2 days from now. Ayanna pointed to the Pinkerton correspondence. "Read," she said, her voice hard. "He leads the survey team to the valley at dawn. Tomorrow." They looked at each other, the full weight of their discovery settling upon them. They had the proof. They had the timeline. They knew the enemy's next moves. "He will be at the bridge dedication," Jack said, his mind racing. "It will be a public event. Newspapers, officials. And we will be there to show them the real man they are celebrating." Ayanna finished, her eyes burning with a fierce, new light. In the small, herb-scented shelter, surrounded by the darkness of a corrupt town, they made a silent vow. They would fight, not just for a piece of paper or a strip of land, but for the truth. They would not let a law written on paper, paid for with bribes, scream louder than a promise made to the earth itself. The fuse had been lit. The meeting took place in a secluded basin carved by Bear Creek, a place sheltered from the wind by a thick stand of ancient ponderosa pines. The air was still and cold, and the only sound was the murmur of water running beneath a thick sheet of ice. Ayanna had sent out the call, and they had come. 3 elders of her own council, their faces like maps of time, their eyes holding the long memory of their people. With them were 2 local ranchers, a father and son named Abernathy, men known for their straight dealings and their respect for the old ways. They were a small group, a tiny island of descent in Trammell's vast ocean of influence, but they were a start. They gathered around a low, smokeless fire. Jack felt the weight of their scrutiny. He was an outsider, a white man, a former soldier. He represented a world that had brought them nothing but broken promises. He did not begin with speeches or appeals to emotion. He simply unrolled the stolen papers and laid the ledger open on a flat rock. "These are Silas Trammell's books," he said, his voice steady and low. He let them look, his finger tracing the neat columns. "This is the name of the territorial judge who granted him the water rights survey. This is the amount Trammell paid him. This is the date. Here is the land agent in Cheyenne. Here is the payment. Here is the congressman who is blocking the investigation into the last treaty's violations. And here is his price." He spoke for nearly an hour, his voice a flat, factual recitation of the rot that lay beneath Red Butte's foundations. He showed them the draft of the removal order, the letters from the Pinkerton agency. He laid the truth bare, piece by ugly piece. Silence followed his words. The elders exchanged long, searching looks. The elder Abernathy, a man with a beard as white as the snow around them, picked up one of the Pinkerton letters. He read it, his lips moving silently, and then placed it back on the rock as if it were a venomous snake. "I've run cattle in this territory for 30 years, he said, his voice a low rumble of disgust. "I've fought drought, blizzards, and wolves. But this is a different kind of predator." He looked from the ledger to Ayanna, and then to Jack. "What would you have us do?" Before Ayanna could answer, the night exploded. The first rifle shot came from the ridge above, a sharp crack that sent echoes bouncing off the frozen rocks. It was followed by a volley, the bullets thudding into the trees around them, kicking up sprays of snow and bark. One of the elders cried out and fell, clutching his chest. Ambush. Betrayal. The thought slammed into Jack with the force of a physical blow. Someone had told them. Someone knew. Reed's voice boomed down from the darkness, full of triumphant malice. "Nowhere to run. Hollis Trammell sends his regards." Ayanna was already moving, her voice cutting through the panic. "To the creek. Now stay on the ice." Jack fired his Winchester toward the muzzle flashes on the ridge, providing covering fire as the Abernathys helped the remaining elders scramble toward the frozen stream. A bullet screamed past his ear. Another plucked at his sleeve. He felt a sudden, sharp, searing pain in his left side, just above his hip. He grunted, stumbling, but forced himself to keep moving, reloading as he ran. The pain was hot and fierce, a brutal reminder of his own mortality. They reached the creek bed and half slid, half ran onto the thick, snow-dusted ice. Ayanna was right. The ice was thick enough to hold them, but the sound of the running water beneath would make it nearly impossible for Reed's men to track them by sound. They were ghosts running on a frozen river. They followed the winding path of the creek for what felt like miles, the sounds of the pursuit growing fainter behind them. Finally, Ayanna led them into a narrow, hidden canyon where the creek disappeared under a solid wall of ice and rock. They were safe. For now. They found a small cave, barely a hollow in the rock, and huddled together in the freezing darkness. The wounded elder was gone, his spirit now with his ancestors. The survivors were alive, but their small spark of hope had been extinguished. Ayanna turned to Jack, her face a pale oval in the gloom. "You are hit." It was not a question. She helped him peel away his coat and shirt. The bullet had torn a ragged furrow through the flesh of his side. It was not deep, but it was bleeding freely, the dark blood a shocking stain against his skin. She took out a small leather pouch. From it, she produced a handful of dried leaves. Sagebrush. She crushed them in her hand and mixed them with a little snow, making a thick, aromatic poultice. Then she began to clean the wound, her touch surprisingly gentle, her focus absolute. The bitter scent of the herb filled the small cave. Jack winced, hissing through his teeth as the poultice stung the raw flesh. The physical pain was afire, but it was the cold dread in his soul that was worse. He had led these people into a trap. His plan, his evidence, had brought nothing but death. The ghosts of the Washita were whispering in his ear again, the faces of his lost men, their eyes full of accusation. "I did it again," he whispered, the words torn from a place of deep, private shame. He was not speaking to her, but to the ghosts. "I gave the wrong order. I led them right into it." Ayanna stopped her work, her hands stilling on his side. She looked at him, her dark eyes searching his face in the dim light. She saw the shadow she had spoken of before, no longer just a flicker, but a vast, devouring darkness. She saw the old wound, the one no bullet had ever made. "This was not your command to give." "Jack Hollis," she said, her voice soft but firm. "This was a betrayal. It was not your fault. It was a snake in our own camp." She resumed her work, binding the wound with a clean strip of cloth from her own shirt. "You did not fail them. You gave them the truth. The truth is never the wrong order." Her words were a balm, a small point of light in his personal darkness. He looked at her, at the fierce, unwavering loyalty in her eyes, at the quiet strength in her hands. He saw a resilience he thought no longer existed in the world. They moved to a small, abandoned trapper's cabin Ayanna knew of, a half-day's journey deeper into the wilderness. They needed to rest, to think. Inside, a small, pot-bellied stove provided a meager but welcome warmth against the biting cold. They sat before it, the silence stretching between them, thick with unspoken thoughts. The raid had changed everything. They were outmatched. Reed and his men were hunting them. The ledger was a powerful weapon, but only if they could get it into the right hands. A direct confrontation was suicide. In the quiet of the cabin, with the wind moaning outside, Ayanna moved. She shifted closer to him on the rough wooden bench, her knee brushing against his. She reached out and gently touched his cheek, her fingers cool against his skin. He looked at her, his breath catching in his throat. Her eyes held his, and then she leaned in and pressed her lips to his. The kiss was not a thing of fire and passion. It was hesitant, short, trembling with a powerful, unspoken emotion. It was as soft as a falling snowflake and carried the weight of a shared lifetime of pain. It was a question and an answer all at once. It was over in a heartbeat, but it left him breathless. She drew back, her dark eyes luminous in the firelight. "That is not a thank you?" she whispered, her voice husky. That is a choice. He understood. This was not a payment for a service rendered, not gratitude for his help. This was her choosing him, a conscious, deliberate act of connection in a world that was trying to tear them apart. He reached up and covered her hand with his thumb gently stroking her skin. In that moment, he felt the ghosts recede, pushed back by the simple, profound warmth of her touch. The moment of peace could not last. The reality of their situation came crashing back in. We have to change the plan, he said, his voice rough. We cannot fight Reed's men. There are not enough of us. And we have lost the winter count. The chapel? Ayanna breathed, her eyes wide with a dawning horror. The betrayal was not just the location. It was the tube. Voss's deputy must have swapped it for a fake. The loss was a physical blow. Their most sacred proof was gone. But they still had the ledger. We have to split up, Jack said, the old commander in him resurfacing, his mind clearing, focusing on strategy. We cannot win a war on the ground, so we have to fight it with words. We need to get this ledger to a newspaper, someone far from Red Butte, someone Trammell cannot buy or intimidate. Laramie, Ayanna said instantly. There is a printer there, Miguel Ortega. He is an honest man. He fears no one. All right, Jack said, his plan forming. You stay here, gather the ranchers. What is left of your council? Reed's men will be looking for us. They will expect us to run. You will do the opposite. You will go to the valley. Reed's surveyors are coming to plant their stakes. You and the others will stop them, peacefully. You will be witnesses. You will show them that this is not empty land. It is your home. And you, she asked, her hand still holding his. Dr. Liao can be trusted. He said, she will ride with me. My side is a liability, and she knows the trails. We will take the ledger to Laramie. We will ride fast and hard. We will get the story out. We will expose Trammell from the one direction he is not watching. It was a desperate gamble, a long shot, but it was the only shot they had. She nodded, her face set with a grim determination. It is a good plan. He knew what he was asking of her. She would be facing Reed and his men with only a handful of ranchers and elders, but he also knew the steel in her spine. She would not break. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the dusty cabin window, they prepared to part. Jack reached into his coat and pulled out a small, folded square of linen. It was an old handkerchief, worn soft with use. In the corner, a faded letter C was embroidered in blue thread, a relic from his life with Eleanor. He pressed it into her hand. So you remember I am still breathing, he said, his voice thick with an emotion he could not name. She closed her fingers around it, her grip tight. She did not need a token to remember him, but she understood the gesture. It was his promise to return. She said nothing, but her eyes gave him a promise of her own. Be safe. Come back. He mounted his horse, Dr. Liao already on hers beside him. He looked back at Ayanna one last time, a lone, strong figure standing in the doorway of the old cabin. Then he turned his horse toward Laramie and did not look back. The ride to Laramie was a special kind of hell. Every jarring step of the horse sent a fresh wave of fire through Jack's side. They rode hard, sticking to the game trails and hidden arroyos that Dr. Liao knew like the lines on her own hand. They were avoiding the main roads, certain that Marshal Voss would have sent men to watch the stagecoach stations and ferry crossings. Voss was not a fool. He would know the ledger was their only remaining weapon and would do anything to stop it from reaching the outside world. By the second day, a fever had taken hold of Jack. The world began to swim at the edges, the snow-covered landscape blurring into a dizzying white haze. He slumped in the saddle, holding on through sheer, stubborn will. They stopped in a wind-scoured shelter of rock and juniper. Dr. Liao helped him dismount, his legs barely holding him. The wound is infected, she said, her voice sharp with professional concern as she examined the angry red streaks spreading from the bandage. You are a fool for not saying anything. I'm fine, he mumbled, his teeth chattering despite the thick wool blanket she wrapped around him. She produced a surgeon's needle and a coil of silk thread from her medical bag, holding them up in the cold, clear light. "If you groan again," she said, her expression a perfect mixture of exasperation and care, "I swear I will stitch you crooked." He managed a weak grin. "Yes, ma'am." She worked with a swift, painful efficiency, cleaning the wound with alcohol that made him see stars, then pulling the edges together with neat, tight stitches. The pain was sharp and clean, cutting through the fog of the fever. When she was done, she fed him a bitter tea that tasted of willow bark and made his head feel clearer. Her quiet competence was a rock in the swirling chaos of his pain and fear. They were a strange pair, the wounded ex-soldier and the calm, steady doctor, united by a common enemy. They reached the outskirts of Laramie on the third day, two weary, dust-covered riders leading exhausted horses. The town was a bustling hub of commerce and noise, a world away from the oppressive quiet of Red Butte. They found the newspaper office in a small brick building on a side street. The Laramie Sentinel, Miguel Ortega, proprietor, the truth, unvarnished. Miguel Ortega was a small, wiry man with a fierce, ink-stained energy. His eyes, magnified by thick spectacles, burned with a passion that seemed too large for his frame. He listened to Jack's story without interruption, his expression growing grimmer with every word. When Jack finally laid the ledger on the cluttered desk, Ortega handled it with the reverence a priest would give a holy text. He read a few pages, his lips moving silently. Then he looked up at Jack, his eyes blazing. "This is not just corruption," he said, his voice trembling with a quiet rage. "This is a declaration of war on the people of this territory. We will print it. We will print every last name, every last dollar." For the rest of the day and deep into the night, the print shop was a hive of activity. Ortega shouted instructions to his young apprentice, his hands moving with incredible speed as he set the type, transforming the cold facts of the ledger into lines of lead. Jack, his side throbbing but his mind clear, helped draft the article. They gave it a simple, powerful headline, "Sweat and Bribes, How Silas Trammell is Buying Wyoming." They laid it all out, the names of the officials, the amounts they were paid, and the direct consequence of their corruption, the theft of the White Crane Valley. Ortega did more than just print. He took the key details to the telegraph office and sent out dispatches along the Union Pacific line, to papers in Cheyenne, Omaha, and even as far as Denver. The story was no longer a secret whispered in the wilderness. It was a fire spreading along the wires. The next morning, as the first copies of the Sentinel were rolling off the press, Dr. Liao introduced Jack to another of Laramie's unlikely residents. Abigail Pike was a lawyer, in a territory where women had only recently won the right to vote. She was a pioneer, a woman who fought her battles with law books and legal precedent instead of a six-gun. She was sharp, articulate, and possessed a mind that cut straight to the heart of the matter. She examined the treaty map that Jack had sketched from memory and the copy of Trammell's removal order. "He is using a classic loophole," she explained, her finger tapping the map. "The original survey was ambiguous about the headwaters of the Eastern Fork. Trammell is claiming it is outside the treaty lands, which gives him the legal pretext to build his dam for his railroad. The removal order is his hammer to clear the people who might challenge that claim." "But it is a lie," Jack said. "That land has been theirs for generations." "The law does not always care about the truth, Mr. Hollis," she replied coolly. "It cares about evidence and jurisdiction. But we can fight this." She began drafting a document. "I will file an emergency injunction with the territorial judge. We will cite the original treaty's clauses on the preservation of traditional lands and, more importantly, the conservation of territorial water sources. Trammell's dam would disrupt the flow of 3 major creeks. That gives the ranchers downstream a legal stake in this fight. We will argue that any survey staking must be halted until the claim can be heard in a proper court." While Jack was fighting a war of ink and law, Ayanna was waging a battle of spirit and earth. She led her small band, the 2 Abernathy ranchers and the remaining Cheyenne elders, into the White Crane Valley. They found the surveyor's initial camp near the mouth of the valley, a raw scar of trampled earth and discarded supply crates. They did not ride in with guns drawn. Instead, they walked. At the place where the valley narrowed, the place Trammell intended to build his dam, they stopped. Ayanna took a bundle of long, slender poles from her horse. To the top of each pole, she had tied a single, perfect white feather from a winter crane. One by one, they planted these poles in a line across the valley floor. A silent, beautiful, and unyielding declaration. This is sacred ground. This is our home. Then, Ayanna began to sing. It was an old song, a seasonal song her grandmother had taught her, its melody rising and falling with the rhythm of the wind and the water. It was a song of thanks, a song of reverence, a song that wove the story of her people into the fabric of the land itself. The others joined her, their voices blending in a harmony that was as ancient as the rocks around them. They were not a war party, they were a prayer. When the local cattlemen who ran their herds in the nearby hills heard what was happening, they came. They did not bring rifles. They brought wagons loaded with fresh water, sacks of cornmeal, and blankets. They stood with Ayanna and her people, a quiet, stubborn line of ranchers and natives, united against the machine of progress that threatened to grind them all into dust. The news from Laramie, when it reached Red Butte, hit like a thunderclap. Marshal Voss, furious at being outmaneuvered, acted with swift and brutal authority. He rode to Laramie with a posse of deputies, armed with a warrant signed by a judge whose name Jack recognized from Trammell's ledger. They stormed Ortega's print shop, smashing the press and confiscating every copy of the newspaper they could find. They arrested Miguel Ortega, charging him with sedition and inciting a public riot. The law was closing in, twisting itself into a weapon to silence the truth. Jack, with the help of Abigail Pike, managed to get Ortega released on a hefty bond, but the message was clear. Trammell and Voss were tightening the noose. The injunction was filed, but the judge, another name from the ledger, was dragging his feet, promising to look at it in due course. They were running out of time. It was then that a new, unexpected ally emerged. Sister Bernadette arrived in Laramie on the morning stagecoach. She found Jack in Abigail Pike's office, a small, unassuming figure in her simple black habit. She carried a large, heavy book bound in worn leather. "Mr. Hollis," she said, her voice calm and clear. "When Marshal Voss came to my special Vespers service, he seemed very troubled. He said he needed to pray for guidance in a difficult matter." Jack frowned, not understanding. What matter? He did not say, but he was very particular about the time. He asked me to note his attendance, as an example to the rest of the town. She opened the heavy book. It was the chapel's baptismal register. "I am very meticulous. You see, after every service, I make a small note of any important events of the day, just a habit." She pointed to a line of spidery script at the bottom of a page. The entry was dated the night of the meeting at Bear Creek. It read, "Marshal Voss attended Vespers, 7 p.m. Spoke at length with Captain Wade Reed in the churchyard immediately following, 8 p.m." Jack stared at the entry. It was an alibi, a meticulously recorded, unimpeachable alibi, for Wade Reed. On the night of the ambush, when Reed should have been leading the attack, he was seen in Red Butte, talking to the marshal. It meant the betrayal came from someone else, a deputy, someone who could have swapped the sealskin tube and ridden hard to lead the attack in Reed's name. It was more than an alibi. It was proof of collusion between the law and Trammell's hired gun. It was a crack in their conspiracy. The tension stretched taut as a bowstring. News came that Silas Trammell himself was on his way to Red Butte. He was coming for the grand opening ceremony of his new railroad bridge at High Basin, a massive steel trestle that was the cornerstone of his empire. It was to be a huge public spectacle, a celebration of his power and vision. At the same time, a grim report came from one of the Abernathy's ranch hands. Captain Wade Reed and a dozen of his men had been seen riding toward the White Crane Valley. Their pack mules were not carrying survey stakes. They were loaded with wooden crates. Dynamite. Reed was not going to wait for the law. He was going to create his own geological instability. Jack knew he had to go back. The fight was no longer in the courts or the newspapers. It was back on the land. He rode out of Laramie that afternoon, pushing his horse harder than he ever had before. He rode through the night, the fire in his side a dull echo of the urgency burning in his soul. He reached the hills overlooking the White Crane Valley just as the sun was beginning to set on the next day. The valley below was quiet. He could see the small, defiant line of Ayanna's feather stakes. He could see the campfires of her small band of guardians. And on a nearby ridge, he could see the dark shapes of Reed's men waiting for the cover of darkness. Ayanna was standing near the creek, her face turned toward the setting sun, when she saw him, a lone rider on the high ridge, silhouetted against the dying, blood-red light of the sky. She could not make out his face, but she knew it was him. She saw the last rays of the sun glint off something in his hand, a small, bright flame in the growing darkness. It was the reflected light of the torch he carried, its fire a promise of the battle to come. He was back, and he had brought the fire with him. He dismounted, the long ride having settled into a deep, grinding ache in his bones and a fire in his side. Ayanna met him as he led his horse into the small, hidden camp. She said nothing, but her eyes drank him in, a quick, assessing glance that took in his weary posture, the fresh bandage Dr. Liao had applied, and the grim set of his jaw. Her own face was etched with the strain of the last few days, but her gaze was as clear and steady as a hawk's. In the quiet space between them, 1,000 words were exchanged without a sound being uttered. "You are alive. I am still here. The fight is not over." That night, under a sky littered with cold, indifferent stars, the final preparations began. The air was thin and sharp, and the silence of the valley was a living thing, broken only by the low murmur of the creek and the sigh of the wind through the pines. They had to be ready for anything. "Tomorrow," Ayanna said, her voice a low command, "Reed will expect us to defend the valley floor. He will not expect an attack from the high cliffs." She pointed toward a jagged spine of black rock that jutted out over the narrowest part of the valley. "The path is treacherous, too narrow for a saddle. If we are to move quickly, we must ride bareback." She led him to a small, secluded meadow where her paint horse stood, its breath pluming in the frigid air. She swung onto its back in one fluid motion, her balance perfect, her body one with the animal. "You must feel the horse beneath you," she instructed. "Feel its muscles. Anticipate its every step. It is not about command. It is about conversation." Jack, who had spent half his life in a cavalry saddle, felt a familiar surge of confidence. He swung himself onto his own mount, a sturdy buckskin. The confidence vanished the instant he was seated. The horse's bare back was broader and less forgiving than a saddle. The spine felt like a ridgepole beneath him, and the powerful slide and bunch of the animal's muscles was a foreign, unsettling sensation. Ayanna led him at a walk, then a trot. He bounced awkwardly, his hands grabbing for a fistful of mane, his legs struggling to find a secure grip. He felt like a sack of potatoes. Ayanna watched him, a small, amused smile playing on her lips. "You are thinking too much, Commander," she said. "You are trying to force the horse to obey. You must listen to it." They approached a section of rocky, uneven ground. Ayanna's horse picked its way through the stones with the sureness of a mountain goat. Jack's horse stumbled, and he nearly went over its side, his dignity saved only by a desperate, clumsy lurch. Ayanna let out a soft, breathy laugh, a sound that was both a tease and an encouragement. She guided her horse alongside his, their legs brushing. Her warmth seeped through his worn trousers. She reached out and placed her hand on his back, between his shoulder blades. "Breathe," she said. "Feel the rhythm. He is telling you where he is going to place his feet. You just have to be quiet enough to hear it." He closed his eyes, forcing his tense muscles to relax. He focused on the steady rise and fall of the horse's chest, the powerful movement of its legs. He began to feel it, the subtle language of the animal. They moved forward again, and this time, it was better. Not graceful, but better. They came to a narrow cut between two large boulders, a passage they would need to navigate in the coming battle. It required a sharp turn and a quick surge of power from the horse. Jack hesitated, his military mind calculating angles and risks. Ayanna just flowed through it. She looked back at him, her eyes sparkling in the moonlight, her breath coming in short, quick puffs from the exertion. "Do not be soft. Hollis," she panted, the challenge in her voice a playful goad. A sudden, raw emotion surged through him, a mixture of frustration, admiration, and a deep, aching tenderness. He gathered the reins, his knuckles white. He looked at her, at this fierce, incredible woman who had turned his world upside down, and a low growl rumbled in his chest. "Sweetheart," the commander growled, his voice a hoarse rasp that was half joke and half prayer. "The West is not gentle." He urged his horse forward, and this time, he did not think, he moved with the animal, a clumsy but united force. They made it through the passage, emerging into the meadow on the other side. He was breathing hard, a triumphant grin spreading across his face. He looked at Ayanna, and she was laughing, a real, open laugh that transformed her face, chasing the shadows from her eyes. He laughed with her, the sound echoing in the cold, clear air. In that moment, they were not a soldier and a scout, not a white man and a Cheyenne woman. They were just two people, on the edge of a battle for their lives, finding a moment of grace in the darkness. They were calming the storm inside, before the real storm broke. Later, in the quiet solitude of a small tent set away from the main camp, the shared laughter faded into a comfortable silence. The air inside was warmer, thick with the scent of canvas and drying sage. A single lantern cast a soft, golden glow, painting their faces in light and shadow. They sat side by side, their shoulders touching, the boundary between them, once a rigid line of suspicion, had become a permeable, shimmering space. Ayanna initiated the shift. She leaned her head against his shoulder, a simple, trusting gesture that spoke volumes. He felt the weight of her, the warmth of her. It was an anchor in the swirling sea of his fear. He turned his head, and their faces were inches apart. He could see the faint tracery of exhaustion around her eyes, the fierce spirit that burned within them. She lifted her head and gently pressed her forehead against his. It was a gesture of profound intimacy, a sharing of thoughts, of spirit, of the silent, humming space between breaths. He did not move, did not act. He simply received the gift of her trust. "Is this okay?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. Her eyes fluttered closed for a second. A silent yes. The moment was a delicate dance, a choice, a pause, a shared breath. They stayed like that for a long time, drawing strength from each other, two halves of a whole, holding the line against the coming darkness. It was a moment of absolute safety, a small, sacred peace carved out of the heart of a war. Just before they parted to get a few hours of sleep before the dawn, Ayanna pressed something into his hand. It was a length of soft, braided deerskin, and woven into it was a single, smooth bead of turquoise, the color of a summer sky. "So you remember this is home," she said softly. "When you come back." She tied it around his right wrist, her fingers deft and sure. The leather was warm against his skin. It was not a trinket, it was a promise, an oath. Their plan was simple, desperate, and relied on perfect timing. Ayanna, with the Abernathys and the Cheyenne elders, would make their way along the high cliffs. Dr. Liao, who had ridden into the valley with a supply of medical gear, had also brought a small pouch of powdered silver. The doctor's precise mind had reasoned that the dampening agent would be enough to ruin the fuses on Reed's dynamite if they could get to them in time. Ayanna's group would be the silent, disabling force. Jack, along with young Miller, who had insisted on riding with him from Laramie, would ride for the High Basin Bridge. They carried saddlebags filled with copies of the Sentinel that Ortega had managed to print before his arrest. Ortega himself, freed by the pressure of a populace suddenly awakened by Abigail Pike's legal challenges, was already there, organizing the railroad workers and miners who had been cheated by Trammell for years. Jack's role was to be the spark, the public face of the accusation, while Ortega fanned the flames among the crowd. As Ayanna gathered her small team, Sister Bernadette, who had arrived with Dr. Liao, took her aside. The old nun's eyes were full of a fierce, practical faith. "Justice needs two things, my child," she whispered, her hand gripping Ayanna's arm. "It needs the truth, and it needs a witness. You must be both." The final piece of the plan was a telegraph, sitting on the desk of the operator in Laramie, written in Abigail Pike's clear, precise hand. It was addressed to the senior territorial judge in Cheyenne. It detailed the injunction, the evidence of Reed's plan to use dynamite, and the sworn testimony of Sister Bernadette. The operator had his instructions send it the moment he received a second wire from Ortega at High Basin. It was their checkmate, if they could live long enough to deliver it. In the pre-dawn gray, as the camp began to stir, Jack found Ayanna standing by the creek, watching the first pale light touch the tops of the mountains. The world was holding its breath. He came to stand beside her. The turquoise braid on his wrist was a small, solid weight. She did not look at him, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "This morning," she said, her voice a low whisper, almost lost in the sound of the water. "Walk on my right side, my left side. I say for my grandmother." He understood completely. She was making a space for him in her world, a world of action and battle, while keeping the side of her heart, her spirit, reserved for the memory and strength of her ancestors. It was the greatest honor she could have given him. He simply nodded. There was nothing else to say. The time for words was over. The High Basin Bridge was a monument to Silas Trammell's ego, a web of black steel stitched across a deep and jagged canyon. It was a declaration of conquest, man's iron will imposed upon the wild, and he had gathered the whole territory to witness its christening. A crowd of miners, railroad workers, merchants, and their families stood huddled against the wind on the near side of the chasm, their faces turned toward a bunting-draped platform where Trammell himself stood, basking in the glow of his own achievement. Marshal Harlan Voss stood beside him, a pillar of civic approval, his polished star glinting in the cold. Flat light. Trammell raised his hands, silencing the polite applause. "Today, we do more than open a bridge," he boomed, his voice carrying over the crowd. "We open the future. We bring commerce. We bring civilization. We bring water to the thirsty and work to the idle. This bridge is not merely steel and rivets. It is a promise." As he spoke, a different kind of promise was being delivered through the crowd. Miguel Ortega, his face set with a printer's fierce conviction, moved through the assembled people, followed by a handful of trusted miners. They were passing out folded sheets of newsprint, the ink still smelling fresh. The headline was "Stark and Brutal Sweat and Bribes." A low murmur began to spread through the crowd, a ripple of confusion that grew into a wave of shock. Men stared at the paper, their lips moving as they read the names and numbers, their own names in some cases, listed next to wages withheld, bonuses denied, all to fund the bribes paid to the men now standing on the platform. Marshal Voss saw it happening. A flash of panic crossed his face. "Confiscate those papers," he barked at his deputies. "Seditious libels, seize them." But it was too late. The truth was like a virus, passed from hand to hand, from eye to eye. The deputies were blocked by a wall of silent, stubborn men who simply stood their ground, their faces hardening as they read. The mood of the crowd was shifting, the festive air curdling into a sullen, angry silence. Miles away, in the deep, cold silence of the White Crane Valley, another kind of promise was being broken. Wade Reed and his men worked with a cold, methodical efficiency, planting their charges along the base of the canyon wall that bordered the creek. Their goal was not just to seal the valley, but to obliterate it. To create a landslide so catastrophic that no one would ever question the geological instability of the land. It was the final, violent erasure of Ayana's world. High above them, moving like spirits across the slick, treacherous surface of the black cliffs, Ayana and her small band crept into position. A late-season snow had begun to fall, the flakes dusting the dark rock and muffling their movements. It was a blessing and a curse, providing cover but making every footstep a gamble. Ayana was the first to go over the edge, a rope tied securely around her waist, held by the steady hands of the elder Abernathy. She descended into the shadows of the canyon floor. Landing as softly as a hunting cat, she moved from one dynamite crate to the next, her fingers working quickly in the freezing air. She opened the small pouch from Dr. Liao and sprinkled the fine, powdered silver over the exposed ends of the fuses, the metallic dust clinging to the cord, designed to absorb the slightest bit of moisture from the air and render the fuses useless. Behind her, the younger Abernathy, his hands surprisingly nimble for a man used to branding irons and rope, began the delicate work of disarming the blasting caps, his breath held tight in his chest. Back at the high basin bridge, the crowd's sullen silence was shattered. A lone rider broke from the trees and galloped straight toward the speaker's platform. It was Jack, his face a mask of cold fury, his horse's hooves thundering on the wooden planks leading to the bridge. He did not stop until he had reined the horse to a rearing halt directly in front of a stunned Silas Trammell. Before Voss or his deputies could react, Jack pulled the stolen ledger from his coat. He held it aloft for all to see. "You talk of promises." Trammell Jack's voice was not a shout, but a clear, carrying command that cut through the tension. "Let's talk about the promises you bought." He opened the book. "To the Honorable Judge Marcus Thorne, for a favorable ruling on water rights, $5,000 to Territorial Land Agent Philip Connolly. For an altered survey map, $2,000. To United States Congressman Robert Dane. To ignore the treaty of 1868, $10,000. He went on, his voice ringing with the cold, hard facts of the ledger. He named the names, the dates, the amounts. With every word, Trammell's face grew paler, his mask of civic benevolence melting away to reveal the frightened, greedy man beneath. The crowd surged forward, no longer a collection of spectators but a single entity, a nascent mob. Their simmering resentment ignited into open rage. The miners and railroad men, seeing the proof of their stolen wages, began to push toward the platform. In the valley, Reed lit a cheroot, the match flaring in the growing twilight. He looked at his handiwork, the line of charges that would remake the landscape in his employer's image. He gave the signal to his man at the detonator plunger. "Do it!" The man slammed the plunger down. Nothing happened. He tried again. Still nothing. A confused look crossed his face. Reed's eyes narrowed, his predator's instinct sensing that something was wrong. He scanned the canyon floor, and his gaze locked onto a flicker of movement near the last charge. He saw a figure, a woman, her hands working at the wires. "We've been played," Reed snarled. He drew his pistol and fired, the shot a flat, ugly crack in the sacred silence of the valley. The bullet ricocheted off the rock inches from Ayana's head. She looked up, her eyes meeting his across the 50 yards of frozen creek bed. The hunt was over. The fight had begun. She drew her own weapon, the gunfire erupting in a chaotic, echoing roar that bounced between the high canyon walls. The sound, faint but unmistakable, traveled up the canyon to the high basin bridge. Jack had just finished his litany of crimes. In the stunned silence that followed his last word, he heard it, a single pistol shot, followed by a ragged volley. He spun around, his eyes scanning the vast chasm below. Far downstream, at the mouth of the valley, he saw them, tiny figures, illuminated by muzzle flashes, locked in a desperate battle by the creek. He saw one figure, smaller than the rest, moving with a familiar, fluid grace. Ayana. He saw Reed and 2 of his men closing in on her, pinning her down behind a cluster of boulders. He did not think. He did not weigh the odds. His own victory on the bridge, the angry crowd, the cowering trammel, it all ceased to exist. There was only Ayanna. He spurred his horse toward the bridge's massive stone abutment. Leaping from the saddle, he scrambled onto the wide stone ledge. Below him, the canyon wall dropped away in a steep, treacherous slope of loose rock and scree. Without a second's hesitation, he launched himself over the edge. He did not fall so much as slide, a controlled avalanche of man and stone. The sharp rocks tore at his clothes, his hands. He felt a sickening, familiar tear in his left shoulder as the old wound, stressed beyond its limits, ripped open again. A wave of agony washed over him, but he did not stop. His boots finding and losing purchase, his descent a desperate, bone-jarring scramble. He landed in a heap at the bottom, the pain in his shoulder a white-hot scream. He pushed himself to his feet, drew his Colt, and ran toward the sound of the guns. He came upon them from the side, a ghost of vengeance emerging from the snowy twilight. Reed was advancing on Ayanna's position, his men providing covering fire. Jack fired twice. One of the men grunted and fell. The other spun around in surprise, and Jack's third shot took him in the chest. Reed, seeing his men fall, whirled around, his face contorted in a mask of pure rage. He saw Jack stumbling toward him, his left arm hanging useless at his side. Reed's lips pulled back in a wolfish snarl. He raised his pistol to fire, but that moment of distraction was all Ayanna needed. She burst from behind the rocks, closing the distance between them with a speed that defied belief. She did not go for his gun. She slammed into him, her shoulder hitting his gun arm, sending his shot wide. He was bigger, stronger, and he brought the butt of his pistol around in a vicious arc, catching her on the side of the head. She staggered, but she did not fall. As he raised his arm for another blow, she moved inside his reach. She grabbed his wrist with both of her hands, dropped her weight, and twisted. It was a move her grandmother had taught her, a technique for breaking the grip of a bear, or a man who thought like one. There was a sickening crunch of bone and sinew. Reed screamed, a high, thin sound of pure agony, and the pistol dropped from his suddenly useless hand. Ayanna spun behind him, yanking his remaining good arm behind his back. She pulled the leather reins from her own belt and, with a few quick, expert raps, had him bound and helpless. Just as Reed's scream died in the valley, a great roar went up from the bridge high above. A man on horseback, waving a piece of paper, had just ridden onto the platform. He was one of Abigail Pike's clerks. He read from the telegraph in a loud, clear voice, the words of the territorial judge echoing in the sudden silence. By order of this court, an immediate injunction is placed upon all activities of the Trammell Corporation in the White Crane Valley pending a full investigation. All survey and construction work is to cease and desist immediately. The crowd, which had been on the verge of becoming a mob, was now a chorus of jubilation. Their anger had found a legal voice. In the confusion, several miners, their faces grim, stepped forward and took the pistol from Marshal Voss's holster. The marshal did not resist, his face pale, his authority gone. Silas Trammell saw his empire crumble in a single instant. He turned to run, to escape the monster he had created. He looked toward the two Pinkerton men who had served as his personal bodyguards, but they simply stood and watched him, their faces impassive. Their contract was to protect a man of power. The man before them now had none. They turned their backs on him. A final, silent judgment. The logic of power had consumed itself. The aftermath was not a single, clean explosion of justice, but a series of quiet, steady clicks, like the tumblers of a great lock falling into place. The territorial hearing in Cheyenne was a stuffy, formal affair, a world of polished wood and dry legal arguments that felt 1,000 miles from the raw, wind-scoured reality of the White Crane Valley. But it was here, in this room of paper and ink, that the final battle was won. Abigail Pike, Her voice calm and incisive, presented the evidence. She laid Trammell's ledger on the judge's bench, its neat columns of corruption a stark and undeniable confession. She presented the letters from the Pinkerton agency, proving the hiring of Wade Reed not as a security man, but as an enforcer. And then she called her star witness. Sister Bernadette, a small, unassuming figure in the grand courtroom, took the stand. She did not speak of violence or ambition. She simply opened her baptismal register and, in her clear, steady voice, read her entry for the night of the Bear Creek ambush, confirming that Captain Wade Reed had been in Red Butte, speaking with Marshal Voss, at the very hour the attack took place. It was a simple, unshakable truth, recorded with the quiet diligence of a woman of faith. It was the linchpin that held the entire conspiracy together, and the stone that shattered it to pieces. The judge, an old, stern man who had seen his share of frontier chicanery, looked from the ledger to the nun's testimony, and his face was like granite. He declared the High Basin project suspended indefinitely, pending a full federal investigation into bribery and conspiracy charges against Silas Trammell and his associates. The paper law, for once, had bent toward justice. But the real victory was not won in a courtroom. It was won in the hearts of the people. The story in the Laramie Sentinel, now being reprinted and circulated throughout the territory, had lit a fire in Red Butte. A petition was started, not by a lawyer or a politician, but by Mrs. O'Rourke in her mercantile. It was a simple, handwritten document demanding the permanent protection of the White Crane Valley and its water sources. The first to sign were the miners and railroad workers, men who now understood that Trammell's progress was built on their backs and with their stolen wages. They were followed by the Abernathys and the other local ranchers, who saw the fight for the valley as a fight for their own survival against the insatiable thirst of corporate greed. Then came the women of the town, led by Sister Bernadette, who added their names with a quiet, firm resolve. The community, once fractured by suspicion and fear, had found its voice, and it spoke in a clear, unified chorus. In the quiet days that followed, Jack had time to think. He sat on the porch of Dr. Liao's clinic, his left arm in a sling, watching the ordinary life of the town flow past him. He had spent his entire adult life believing in the power of paper, orders, manifests, treaties, laws. He had believed that if the paperwork was right, then the world was right. He had been so focused on the legality of the treaty map that he had almost missed the truth of the land itself. He had needed Ayanna to teach him to listen to a different kind of authority, the authority of the earth, of a people's history, of a song sung to the wind. He realized now that his greatest failing as a commander had not been a tactical error, but a failure of listening. He had trusted the maps in his hands more than the men under his command, or the world under his feet. The wound in his shoulder was an old story, but he was finally beginning to understand its language. Ayanna, too, was finding her own kind of peace. The return of the real winter count, discovered in the marshal's office after his arrest, was a cause for quiet celebration among her people. But for her, the victory was more personal. For years, she had carried the fear that her people's voice, their history, was being erased, stolen, and silenced. She had fought to preserve it, a lonely guardian of a fading memory. Now, she had spoken, and the world had listened. She had not just spoken for herself, but for her grandmother, Navoka, and for all the generations who had sung their songs in the valley. The fear of being silenced had been replaced by the fierce, liberating power of her own voice. The wheels of justice, once set in motion, ground forward with an inexorable slowness. Marshal Harlan Voss was stripped of his star and taken in chains to the territorial prison, his face a mask of disbelief, a man undone by a nun's meticulous bookkeeping. Wade Reed, his broken arm in a crude splint, faced a litany of federal charges, from assault to conspiracy to attempted murder. He sat in his cell, his smirk gone, replaced by the flat, dead-eyed stare of a predator in a cage. And Silas Trammell, the great visionary, found himself utterly alone. His contracts were canceled, His political allies vanished like mist in the morning sun, and a federal indictment was being prepared that would dismantle his empire. Piece by corrupt piece. He had tried to tame the West, but the West, in its own quiet, stubborn way, had tamed him. The physical healing took its own time. Dr. Liao, her fingers as skilled with a needle as they were with a pen, stitched the torn muscles of Jack's shoulder back together. It was a long, painful process, and he bore it with a stoic silence that she found both admirable and infuriating. When the doctor was finished, Ayana came and sat beside him. The new scar was a raw, angry red. A fresh chapter laid over the old, faded story of his war wound. She reached out and gently laid her hand over the bandage, her touch radiating a soft, steady warmth. Wounds tell stories. "Jack Hollis," she said, her voice a low murmur. "Do not let them write the last chapter." He looked into her eyes and understood. The scar was not an ending. It was a part of him, a reminder of a price paid. But it did not have to be the thing that defined him. He could choose to write a new story, a different ending. A few days later, as a fragile spring sun began to melt the last of the snow, Jack saw Ayana walking alone toward a stand of young birch trees near the creek. He knew, with an instinct he was just beginning to trust, that she was going to a sacred place. He followed at a distance, stopping at the edge of the grove. She had built a small fire and was burning sweetgrass, its fragrant smoke curling up toward the pale blue sky. Her head was bowed, and she was speaking in a low, soft chant, her words a conversation with the land, with her ancestors, with the spirits of the valley. He did not want to intrude. He felt like a trespasser on holy ground, but he also felt a deep, profound need to be there, to bear witness. He took a single, hesitant step forward. "Ayana," he said, his voice quiet, full of a humility he had never known before. She looked up, her prayer interrupted, but her eyes held no anger, only a quiet questioning. "I am sorry to disturb you," he said. I would like your permission to stand at the edge of your ritual, to watch, to listen." She studied his face for a long moment. Seeing the genuine respect, the honest plea in his eyes, she saw a man who was no longer trying to command the world, but to understand his place in it. She gave a single, slow nod. It was all the invitation he needed. He walked to the edge of the birch grove and stood in silence, a respectful witness, as she turned back to her prayers, sharing the sacred space with him. The good news came not from a courtroom, but from a handshake. The elder Abernathy, his son beside him, met with the Cheyenne Council. He made a promise. From now on, his ranch would leave open a wide corridor of land along the creek, a permanent right-of-way for the great herds of bison to travel to their summer grazing grounds, just as they had for centuries. Other ranchers followed his lead. The valley would not just be preserved. It would be allowed to live, to breathe, to be the wild, beautiful thing it was always meant to be. The new feeling of peace and possibility settled over Red Butte. One afternoon, Jack and Ayana were in Mrs. O'Rourke's mercantile, restocking supplies for the journey back to his freight wagons. Ayana was examining a bolt of blue calico cloth, a rare moment of simple, domestic pleasure. Jack came up behind her, and in the quiet, sun-dusted aisle, he leaned in and kissed her, a soft, gentle kiss that spoke of promises kept and futures shared. "Hem," a voice boomed from behind the counter. They sprang apart, Ayana's face flushing a brilliant crimson. Mrs. O'Rourke was standing there, her hands on her hips, a fearsome but loving matriarch, a twinkle of pure mischief in her eyes. "There will be no kissing in the middle of my store," she declared, her Irish brogue thick. "It is bad for business. Scares off the customers." Jack just grinned, his arm sliding possessively around Ayana's waist. He looked at the storekeeper, his eyes dancing. "We apologize, ma'am," he said, his voice full of mock seriousness. "We will be sure to pay extra in affection tax." Mrs. O'Rourke tried to hold her stern expression, But a great, booming laugh escaped her. Even Ayana, her face still flushed, could not help but smile. The sound of their shared laughter filled the small store, a simple, happy sound that promised a new season, a new beginning. The spring that followed the winter of their fight was a slow, hesitant affair, a cautious greening of the land, but summer arrived in a triumphant blaze of glory. The sun beat down on the Wyoming prairie, curing the wild grasses to a pale gold and releasing the sharp, clean scent of sagebrush into the air. The creek in the White Crane Valley, once a frozen, silent river, now ran clear and cold as liquid glass, its banks thick with willow and cottonwood. Life, having held its breath through the long, hard winter, had returned with a fierce and joyful insistence. At the edge of this reborn valley, in the old community house that had been scrubbed clean and given a fresh coat of whitewash, a new kind of life was also taking root. Ayana had started a school. It was a school unlike any other in the territory. Her students were a mix of Cheyenne children from her own community and the children of the ranchers and merchants from Red Butte. In the morning, she taught them their letters and numbers, her voice patient and low as she guided clumsy fingers in the formation of words. But in the afternoon, the real lessons began. She took them out into the valley and taught them the language of the land. They learned to read the tracks of a deer in the soft earth, to know the names of the prairie flowers, to understand the shifting moods of the sky. She taught them how to ride, how to find clean water, how to live not just upon the land, but within it. It was a curriculum of survival and respect, and the children, free from the prejudices of their parents, learned it with an open and eager curiosity. The final word on the matter of legal justice came not with a gavel's bang, but with the arrival of a letter bearing a Washington postmark. Abigail Pike rode into Red Butte holding it aloft like a banner of victory. She found Jack and Ayana sharing a cool drink on the porch of the now thriving Mercantile. The letter confirmed that the federal investigation into Silas Trammell was expanding, reaching into the halls of Congress itself. But it was a handwritten addendum from the territorial judge that brought a slow smile to Jack's face. The judge praised the citizens of Red Butte and their allies, citing the community's unified stand as a new model for how the people of the territory could and should act as stewards of their own land and water. The community itself had become a witness, and its testimony had been entered into the law of the land. Their wedding was not held in the chapel, but under the sprawling arms of an ancient cottonwood tree that grew by the stream where they had first stood together in prayer. There was no fancy dress, no formal procession. Ayana wore a simple buckskin dress, beautifully beaded by the women of her community. Jack wore a clean shirt and trousers, the turquoise braid she had given him a vivid slash of color against his wrist. Their guests were the small, loyal band who had fought alongside them. The Abernathys stood with their hats in their hands, their faces weathered and kind. Mrs. O'Rourke wept openly into a large linen handkerchief. Sister Bernadette, her prayer book in hand, served as the witness before God, her voice a comforting murmur as she spoke of loyalty and love. And Dr. May Liao, her usual impassive expression softened by a rare, gentle smile, captured the moment for eternity. The bright flash of her wet plate camera preserving the image of two people, once broken, now made whole in the quiet, sun-dappled shade. The winter count was returned to its place of honor in the community house on a warm, still afternoon. Ayana unrolled the great hide, its painted history stretching back through generations of her people. Her elders watched in reverent silence as she took up a fine brush made from horsehair and pigments mixed from clay and berry juice. With a steady hand, she added a new symbol to the final, unfinished year. It was not a pictograph of battle or of death. She drew two images, side by side. One was the graceful, long-legged form of a white crane, its wings spread as if in flight. The other was the stark, geometric outline of a steel bridge, but she drew it whole and unbroken, without the fire and dynamite that had threatened it. Beneath them, she drew a single straight line, the symbol for a voice. It was the year. She explained to the children gathered at her feet. to be remembered as the year the voice of the people proved stronger than the sound of money. In the quiet rhythm of their new life, the final healing took place. Jack, the former commander, learned the profound strength of listening. He no longer felt the need to give orders, to control the world around him. He found a deeper satisfaction in simply being present, in learning the pace of the seasons, in listening to the stories in the wind. He had spent his life fighting the West, and he was finally learning how to be at peace with it. And Ayanna, who had spent her life as a guardian, a warrior, a sentinel of her people's past, learned that she could open her heart without losing herself. She learned that love was not a surrender of her identity, but an expansion of it. She could be a wife and a teacher, a leader and a partner. She could let herself be loved, truly and deeply, without fear. One brilliant summer afternoon, they rode out together, their horses moving at an easy pace across a vast, rolling sea of sagebrush. A herd of wild mustangs, their coats shining in the sun, thundered across a distant ridge, their manes and tails flying, a living embodiment of the freedom they had fought so hard to protect. The air was warm and clean, and the sky was a vast, aching blue. It was the same land that had been the backdrop for their brutal winter struggle, but now, bathed in the soft, golden light of summer, it seemed a place of infinite peace, of boundless promise. That evening, they sat together on a low hill overlooking the valley, watching the long shadows stretch and the sky bleed into the soft pastels of sunset. A comfortable silence settled between them, the kind of silence that exists only between two people who know each other's souls. Jack leaned back on his elbows, a contented sigh escaping his lips. He reached over and took her hand, his thumb gently stroking her knuckles. He turned to her, a slow, roguish grin spreading across his face, the old light of the commander glinting in his eyes, but softened now, transformed into something else entirely. He leaned in close, his voice a low, intimate whisper against her ear. "The commander requests permission to be soft today." Ayanna looked at him, and a joyous, unrestrained laugh bubbled up from her chest, a sound as clear and free as the creek running through the valley below. She leaned into him, her head resting on his good shoulder. "Permission granted. Jack Hollis," she said, her voice full of a deep and abiding love, "but only at home, out there." She gestured toward the vast, darkening landscape. "The west is still not gentle." They sat and watched the first stars appear, two small figures in a vast and beautiful world. They had learned the great, hard lesson of the frontier that justice is not a thing given, but a thing made, forged in the fires of courage by the hands of a community. And they had learned the even greater lesson of the heart that love is not a miraculous rescue, but a quiet, daily choice. A choice to stand together, to listen, to heal, and to build a future, not in defiance of the past, but in honor of it, a future guided by the steady, unwavering light of who they were. Thank you so much for joining us on this journey. We would love to hear your thoughts, so please leave a comment and let us know where in the world you are listening from, so we can all connect to help us create more stories like this. Please subscribe to our channel Wild West Tales. Give this video a like, and press the hype button to help share this tale with a wider audience.